Hello all, Rick here with a video breaking down the first warp vessel created by humans that predates it all. Technically a non-Federation and even non-Starfleet vessel, I'm leaving it in the Starfleet playlist because let's face it, it was the origin for the whole thing. So, beginning with the real world design origins. The Phoenix existed in the lore before it was depicted on screen, at least its role did. Concepts are generated for apocryphal material such as the Bonaventure by Greg Jean, which featured a massive radiation shield, suggesting that the warp technology was not as refined yet, and the cockpit needed protection. Okuda's team then added the warp nacelles to throw in some TOS style. This vessel was used as the stand-in for the Phoenix until First Contact retconned it away as the Phoenix took front and centre. John Eves designed the Phoenix for that film, taking into consideration the Bonaventure's design as much of the background tech and launch procedure had evolved behind the scenes since its conceptualizing. The primary change was slimming it down so that it could more conceivably launch from a Titan-style rocket, which had been selected by production. This led to the retractable nacelles, and throughout the style was to look like a vessel that could have been constructed with today's technology. The vessel was named the Phoenix for the analogy of the legendary bird rising from the ashes reborn. In the lore of the Star Trek universe, we face a Third World War, which was over by 2063. The exact dates of this event are currently in flux, with Trek shifting the dates of several contributing factors, but the overall dates are agreed to be around 2026 to 53. Following this global conflict, where nuclear weapons were used extensively, the world was plunged into an era known as the post-atomic horror. Society was fractured, and while governments still existed, they too were scrambling to retain power and maintain supply lines and infrastructure. In this era, despots like Colonel Philip Green rose and enacted a purge against all irradiated humans to avoid mutations being passed on. This deserves its own video on this time, but essentially, things were bleak. The state of the world had been observed for decades by the nearby Vulcans, who had earmarked Earth as a place of interest, in the same way the Federation would later observe pre-warp civilizations. So it's understandable that the Vulcans moved to investigate the world of humans when, only 10 years after nuking each other, they detected a warp signature in the Sol system. The Phoenix had taken flight. The schematics were finalised in 2059, and around 2060 Zephram Cochrane moved to an unused missile silo in Bozeman, Montana, along with a team of engineers focused on the warp theories of the centuries before. It would take 2.5 years to construct the prototype vessel. While history would remember him for ushering in a new age of exploration and development, his self-ascribed motivation was financial, looking to sell his invention to any willing government, but when the Vulcans landed directly in front of him following this, priorities shifted. The vessel was rudimentary by future warp standards, and even made use of chemical rockets to launch into space on the back of a Titan-style rocket. While the Phoenix itself was nuclear-powered, using materials from an abandoned nuclear silo, somehow, Cochrane was allowed to make extensive use of this silo, and even acquired a dormant ICBM nuke, which he utilised in the construction of the vessel. I would assume that the American government must have allowed him to do this, or it was just not in a position to enforce his commandeering. There are contradicting accounts if the Phoenix had dilithium in its reactor, which is irrelevant for now, but I have a video covering those accounts. However, much of the construction was down to salvaging and scrap from resourceful accomplices such as Lily Sloan. On April the 4th, the Borg attempted to prevent the launch of the vessel, but only managed to damage it, which the Enterprise E crew repaired, although they had to break cover to do so. So, the ship was 20 metres long, with a diameter of 3.1 metres and a height of 3.2. With the nacelles extended, it was 11.3 metres wide, and when the modified Titan II was attached, the full length was around 45 metres. There are two ways the vessel could have landed. One design showed that the cockpit was detachable and contained a parachute system, as well as flotation devices, which is how it was used to land, separating the cockpit for re-entry and a splashdown landing. The other is from behind-the-scenes illustrations that shows the Phoenix feathering its re-entry by having the extended nacelles create drag and the ship reorienting itself to descend thrusters first to slow it. Either way, parachutes were then deployed, but if it landed in the water, my only question is, where in Montana? The entire vessel was designed to be used once, considering its multi-stage jettisoning of components. The cockpit contained 3 seats, radio communications systems, laser gyros, subspace sensors, a computer system with its own power supply, and an optical storage disc music player because every historic flight should have a soundtrack. While not apparent on diagrams I have seen, it must have had a deflector system or some precursor effect, or it did not and Cochrane just got very lucky. The body was pretty much entirely the warp assembly, but it also contained no warp core. The nacelles were kept retracted into the fuselage until they were needed for safety, and then deployed before the warp jump. There were fuel tanks containing something, possibly antimatter considering it could leak theta radiation when damaged. But again, the Phoenix is apparently nuclear powered and used that system to generate plasma, so these tanks could be for the RCS thrusters. The fusion tokamak was located just above the primary thrusters, which supplied most of the push for warp, as well as the needed deceleration upon exiting. The nacelles had what looks like Bussard collectors on the front, and some diagrams label them as just this, meaning that they collected interstellar particles to use as fuel, but this seems redundant in a system that was disposable. Another source lists them as parts of the plasma assembly, where the warp plasma is primed for injection into the warp coils. The warp coils then do their thing and generate the warp bubble, with the spent plasma released from the rear of the nacelle. The vessel was capable of achieving 0.3 the speed of light at maximum speeds, although it had to accelerate to this over quite the time. The engine Cochrane constructed could theoretically reach warp 1.2 on paper, however it never did, instead capping out somewhere between warp 0.10469 and 0.1. Its hull was titanium. The vessel did exactly what it was supposed to do, and after completing a single warp jump, it made its way back to Earth at a third of light speed before re-entry and setting down again in time for that night's first contact. The Phoenix itself was then studied and used as blueprints by Cochrane's team and multiple governments as the world unified to explore the final frontier, now aware that they were not alone in the universe. The ship eventually was transferred to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum by the time of the NX project that was in development. Bozeman itself became a historic site, with a statue of Cochrane and even a replica launch ride for the Phoenix that would make a short Warp 1 jump away from Earth's orbit and then return. So, that covers the lore of the Phoenix and its specifications. There is still a lot of grey area in canon as to exactly how it works, just as the Bonaventure's existence is now a hazy one, but the humans' first warp vessel unlocked a whole new era for humanity. I wonder what would have happened if the Vulcans never made first contact and Cochrane went on to sell his invention instead. That might make for an interesting what-if scenario. Until then, thanks for watching. I've been Rick and I'll see you later. Until then again, goodbye.